Hello and welcome everybody to a very special edition of Topless Topics, the channel that seeks to destigmatize female toplessness through repeat exposure. We also talk about all sorts of subjects like mental health and homeless solutions and legalizing sex work, which brings me to our interviewee for today. I am going to go ahead and turn over the floor and let you introduce yourself, and then we can jump into some questions because I know you've got a busy schedule and I don't want to waste your time.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm TammyJo Eckhart. I am a historian, ancient historian, as well as a writer, educator, and activist for alternative sexualities and women. And I've
Nice.
been published since 1995. So I've very actively been pursuing these fields of mine since then.
Yeah, and the way I found you is through the what is it called, the Erotic Creators Club? Is that the word for it? Right, over on Discord, which has been a really useful resource for meeting other sex workers. And, you know, I'm kind of shoehorned in with sex workers because female nipples are considered sex explicit nudity. So, yeah, that's been a great thing. How did you get involved with that server, and what have your experiences been with it?
I got an invitation from the person who created it, Eleanor, and it said, hey, you were listed as an 18 plus content creator on Patreon. Would you like to come and join this club? And I thought, I'll check it out. And I checked it out, and I've been going since, I believe, June of 2022.
And so it's linked to Patreon, but it's not officially Patreon. It's a resource for people who primarily use Patreon, right?
It is actually officially linked, I think, to Patreon because they started the clubs, and it was a matter of which clubs actually lasted. They had like a 3-month period. And then this club lasted a little longer and a little longer and a little longer. So like if anyone's ever gone to Patreon and you were trying to look up Topless Topics or me, you couldn't find us, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have to know our website. Yeah. But you can now look up the creator clubs, and the person who is the current president and then the co-chair and then me and one other person were the board of the club. You can actually find us, and that does link to our websites.
Really
so
nice.
That's kind of a sneaky way to at least get some of us some notice.
Yeah. Well, so weekly on the server, you have these chats where people can participate and you talk about different subjects. So one of them was like how to start a podcast. There's other ones about how to incentivize people to join your Patreon, you know, kind of formalized discussions. And I've been to a few of them and they're invaluable. A lot of the advice isn't just for sex workers. So, you know, even if anyone is listening to this and just wants to like get to know more about creating and meet other creators, I do recommend it. Where do people go to join the server?
I think you have to go through Patreon, and there's a form that you fill out to ask to become part of the club now. So once it was official, they have an official form.
Yeah.
And it has like some rules, like you have to have at least 10 subscribers, things like that. But people who were there originally, if you don't, then you were folded into it. Grandfathered in, I guess, is the term that we used into that, because we didn't want to lose anyone.
Of course, they're extremely careful that everyone is 18 plus, because as we all know, if children even know that sex exists, then they'll immediately run out and have it, apparently. So yeah, anyway, like I was saying, it's been a really wonderful resource, and I highly recommend that if everyone is 18 plus, you go ahead and check it out, especially if you're interested in being a content creator. So as for you personally, how long have you been, I know you said you're mostly academic, but especially as far as your creative work, how long have you been doing that, and how did you get into it?
So I've always been a writer. My mother was a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer. So I always
Hey, my dad is too.
Yeah. Yeah. I always wrote. I have, like you're a mom, you keep all these things, right, that your kids create in school. And she gave me a scrapbook when I was an adult, and it, had like these stories I had written in preschool and kindergarten. Aww. And things like that. And I read them and I'm expecting, okay, this is going to be like, crazy. And I'm like, no, I actually had a concept of characters and plots. That's pretty cool. So I've always done that. But I went to New York City, to Manhattan, and I was at Columbia University to get my master's degree. And while I was there, I got involved in the kink community. And through that, I met authors who are writing fiction, nonfiction, both. And one of them said to me, here's a publisher. His name was Richard Casack Books. And they said, contact him. And I sent him a couple short stories. And he wrote back and he said, so send me a few more. We want to put out an anthology of yours.
That's exciting.
I went down to talk to him. And by the end of the conversation, he's like, so what's your next book with us going to be? So it was once.
So that was really lucky then. That worked
it was
out
really
so well.
lucky. And
I mean, you were a good writer, obviously, but there's a lot of good writers that struggle for years and years and years. So I'm glad it worked out.
And I currently do, because Richard Casack book at that time, we're talking about the mid 90s here, was one of the big 8 publishers. So there used to be, folks, 8 big publishers. Now, before then, there were even more. So these are like people whom like.
And you're not just talking about erotic, you're talking about in general, like all kinds of books. Okay.
In general. So he was the biggest sex, erotica, and nonfiction books about sex publisher in the world. So my first book premiered in New York City and London the same day.
Whoa.
Yeah, so that's the reach he had. But within 4 years, his company was dead. The line for publishing is very narrow in terms of the margin. And if you make one decision, and he made a few decisions about where he wanted to take some of the next books, and none of the authors were really behind this idea. And then it turned out the readers were also not behind the ideas.
Interesting.
So, you're not making good sales for a couple of years, you fold.
Yeah. What kind of direction were they trying to go for?
So he had this idea of starting like superhero and superheroine kinky novels.
That's a little too early. Now it might be popular, but in the 90s.
Yeah. Well, especially if you do it as a graphic novel, right? Mm-hmm. But his was just, normal text-based. And he was asking authors, without consideration for our own expectations, experiences, and interests, hey, would you do a book like this? And oftentimes there was a mismatch. So he approached me and said, hey, can you make me a super lesbian character? I'm like, at that point, I had not yet had a relationship with a woman. So I said, I don't really feel like I have the experience to write. And so, it was just, I think it was too far astray from what the readers expected. They expected fantasy, horror, science fiction, mythic stories, not superheroes.
So there's a show, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called Sex Education.
I've heard about it.
And it's on its 4th season, and we've been watching it, and I don't really like this season because they made a lot of the characters like very unlikable. But it's interesting because one of the characters is actually trying to become a writer, and she's kind of running into that whole, like, she's a good writer, but there's a lot of hierarchy of, for instance, she's going to school, and the one that got the internship, her dad bought a wing of the school. And so she's having this hard life lesson about classism and favoritism and stuff like that, which is just interesting that, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about that show. So that's really interesting. And so how did you go from writing books to other kind of stuff that you work on?
I was in graduate school, so I was also starting to get into publishing, historical research and information like that. And within the kink community in Manhattan, there was, in the mid 90s, there was now an attempt. It wasn't just play parties and going to public dungeons. they were getting their own intelligentsia. There we go. I finally said the word right, folks. Intelligentsia. And
can you define that really quick, please?
So these are people who write about community, its interests, its needs, its concerns. It can also include people that tell you how to do things, but they do it from a position of writing nonfiction or sometimes writing fiction based on their own personal experiences. So we started getting within BDSM literature a lot more memoirs, how-to books.
Yeah, that stuff exists. It's not all just, porn.
yeah.
That's interesting.
And classes and having conventions for the first time and conferences where people would get together. I went to the 25th anniversary for TESS, which is TES. It's the Eulenspiegel Society, which is the oldest organized kink group in the United States. I went to their 25th anniversary conference, and I sat with scholars and I sat with other authors, and people came and listened to us. And it was like, whoa, the community has advanced now to the point where we're actually starting to think about what we're doing and reflect on it, and, and consider, what did the generation and 2 generations before me do that they didn't want me to have to go through? What did I do and go through that I don't want the next generation to go through?
Yeah. It's amazing to think that, sexuality obviously has been with humanity since the very beginning. It's this vital part of most people's lives. And even if people aren't necessarily engaging in sex themselves, obviously it's all around them. And yet very little research and stuff like that is talked about because it's considered so taboo. And so you have these people that are curious about kink or curious about, questioning their sexual identity, all that other stuff, Googling it online and finding completely subjective, harmful, in a lot of cases, lack of discussions about consent. Like we can get into it later, but I know that when 50 Shades came out, it was horrifying to so many people in the BDSM community because it was normalizing these very harmful views of what BDSM actually is. And so what platforms other than writing have you put content out on or engaged with content on?
So I'm a relatively well-known educator within the kink community. I won an award in 2019 for a couple decades of educational work. So, I started the very first platform with like the bulletin boards. I don't know if anyone out there is old enough to remember this, but they're basically like email lists.
Okay.
And you would write to the email list.
Yeah.
And so 1990, my future husband set me up on that, literally so we could just talk to each other when I was living in Rome for a year.
Yeah, this was before Discord and everything.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. There are no images. You can't even include images at that level. And I met people, Janet Hardy. I met Jay Wiseman. These are, generation before me in the kink community. These are the people who started the small presses that had to take over when Richard Casack books fell apart. So now there's mostly just small to smallish, medium-sized publishers out there, but they're run by people who live this lifestyle, who do this. And so they make sure that what they're putting out is quality. And even if it's fiction, it's like not promoting things that would be illegal or harmful.
Yeah.
Or that it's very clear you are reading fiction.
Yeah. It's hard to find stuff like that because, still now, but a lot more when I was younger, I'm a big fan of boy love stuff, yaoi or whatever. And they're mostly comics, but there's some books that I've read too. And almost every single one has some form of abuse going on. And I think a big part of that is cultural, because a lot of them are Japanese or Korean, and, you know, it's even more taboo to be gay there. And so there's this element of like being forced into it. But there's series that I used to like, and now I'm like, oh my God, that was so bad. And like the ones that I read now, sometimes I'll look at the comments and like there'll be an abusive character, and there's, I assume, children, you know, teenagers in the comments being like, oh, he's so, you know, romantic. He just really cares about, and it's just like, oh my God, no. So it's frustrating that, you know, there's, like you were saying, this well-researched, ethically considered information and stories out there, but it's so hard to find because so many people are just going to the internet. And I imagine, how do like educational classes and the kind of stuff you're talking about, how do people what do they have to do to find out about it? Like, I assume you can't really very often have a new book just sitting in the front of a bookstore. It has to be like tucked away by the Playboy. Actually, Playboy doesn't do video pictures anymore, but
yeah, if you can even get your books in bookstores anymore, because so many of them have folded. So one of the better places to find out about events and stuff is actually a site called FetLife.com. And I do have an account on FetLife. I try to use it more, but so for folks out there, I'm the head of a poly kinky household. So this is like my life. I know I may not look like it with my kimono on here, but this is my life. And so a lot of times people will go to online communities because they don't have this in their life. And since I do, I don't have as much time to be on, but I am on there every now and then. And it's a very good place because there'll be forums on there for individual states or for bigger cities. And so you can check on a place like that and see about events going on in your area.
Wow.
I mean, it used to be in the 90s. You learned about, it's called a munch. You got together at a restaurant.
I have a friend that goes to some of those. So
yeah, and you just like ate, you talked about things. And then, you know, through them, you might learn about other groups. And yeah, I was in New York City.
So word of mouth, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And in New York City, you could look at like, there were, you know, freebie newspapers that would have LGBTQ groups. And
which, I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of intersex with kink and BDSM in general. So
yeah. And so you could look at those and find them more easily.
I want to jump in and clarify. I'm not saying that all LGBTQ is kink. It's more that both are ostracized. And so, you know, strange bedfellows kind of, not that, because I don't want people thinking I'm saying like all gay people are into kink. So anyway, sorry.
Well, and also if you were lesbian and kinky or gay and kinky, you would find stuff in these newspapers and free magazines, and there'd be articles, you know, maybe once a month by a leather man or a leather woman, you know, kinky person. And so that was one of the ways you could find out about stuff. But there was a lot of word of mouth, and then these email lists, these bulletin boards. And of course,
one of the benefits of word of mouth is there's a little bit more vetting going on, because you're not going to tell someone who's creepy about one of these. So that is one benefit. But yeah.
So, I mean, that's, if people are really interested, that's what I would say. Get on FetLife. There are other kinky online groups too, but they often, number one, cost money. And number two, they sadly don't have as long of a history. And, you know, it's kind of like the thing many of us are going through now as different social media sites like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and things like that start cracking down. They think they're protecting people.
Thanks, Foster Sesta.
You know, where do you go? And the problem is anywhere you go is going to be really tiny. And so you're not going to have your potential outreach.
Yeah. And you're usually just going to end up on a porn site when you're trying to look up most of that stuff. It's interesting because I've heard of FetLife. I've never really tried to use it before. But I mostly basically just heard of it as trying to find sex partners, sort of Tinder before Tinder. I didn't even know that there was all this other side of it. So that's really cool. I'll definitely have to check it out more.
Yeah. I mean, if you put up a profile there, if you join, you're going to get people emailing you, asking you, hey, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
But
I mean, I get messages like that on any, OK Cupid, Plenty of Fish, whatever.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Welcome to being a woman on the internet.
Yeah. And I don't think it's any more than what you'd get if you're using Twitter.
Twitter.
But it's certainly more than what you would get, let's say, on Facebook or Pinterest or Tumblr, things like that. And I am all on those different sites primarily because when I got published, I was told you need to find ways to reach out.
Yeah.
Because a publisher, yes, they do some marketing, but they also want you, the author, to do marketing. So a lot of times I have these things simply because I'm supposed to do outreach. And then it turns out I have friends and family on them. So I can also use that to keep in touch.
Oh, okay. So you don't keep your identities completely separate?
So I am completely out. But like on Facebook, I have my author page and I have my personal page. They're different.
Right.
But I still talk about kinky stuff on my personal page.
Yeah.
I figure at that point, if someone's going to follow me over there and they don't like it, well, go away then.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a privilege of being, established and having your partners be in on it and being able to separate yourself from family or whoever who can't accept it. I'm pretty open about my stuff. And especially when I'm like meeting other young people or something like that, I'm generally pretty open about it. My big fear is that I have kids who are in school right now. And I'm kind of just waiting for that moment where I get popular enough to get doxxed.
Yeah.
Because it's gonna happen. And the school is fairly, they try to be progressive, like they have multicultural nights and everything. So I'm hoping they wouldn't be like, I don't think they're going to kick my kids out of school over it, but like I'm on the PTA and stuff. And so it's going to be like really awkward if that pops up, especially because I am on Instagram and YouTube and everything. Obviously I put up very censored versions of my content and it often gets banned, even if it is censored. But one of these days, someone in the school, someone in the PTA is going to stumble onto one of my videos thanks to recommended, and they're going to be like, is that Cleo? So I'm kind of like just in this constant state of like, oh God, is this the day? But at the same time, it's going to happen. And I'm not ashamed of what I do. I really do want to raise awareness about the insanity of gender-based censorship. I think it's insane that the majority of Americans are just like, yeah, female nipples are sexual and male nipples aren't. And I mean, especially when you get into talking about trans people and non-binary, like anyway, I ranted about a lot I ranted a lot about that in my own videos and I don't want to rob the floor. So I will shut up about that. But if anyone is watching this and would like to know more of my thoughts, go to toplessobits.org and you can search for them. So what kind of audience participation have you experienced? I guess like feedback from readers and stuff like that and people you've talked to.
I want to add to what you're talking about there about, why you're not completely out and you're worried about the doxing and everything. The decision to come out is a very important and personal decision. I have actually taught a class on this issue several times at kink events, both from like the convention level to like just going to a munch and being a guest speaker.
Especially in the era of cell phones.
Yeah. I made that decision in 1994. And so we went from using pseudonyms like on these online bulletin boards to just being ourselves. And that coincided with university I was at, Columbia University, having a kink organization created there.
That's awesome.
And I was the secretary of that organization. And I decided, you know what? I'm starting to write. And if I'm doing this, I shouldn't be doing things that I'm ashamed of. If other people are ashamed of it, that's on them. And I'm not going to say this was the best decision I ever made because I'm pretty sure I'm not a tenured professor now, in part because of this.
Yeah.
But
probably.
I don't really have any regrets.
And that's
really
tremendous.
Hard to blackmail because if you come at me and say, I'm going to tell someone, I'm going to say, tell them what?
Yeah.
What is it that you can't find about me in 5 minutes of Googling? Nothing. Yeah. There's really nothing.
And I mean, you're very courageous for having that attitude because, there's a lot of fallback that people can have. And I mean, I kind of understand when it's very hard for me to get my followers to followers, supporters, they all feel gross, but to talk about, to even like share links to my stuff to their friends and post on their own social media, even anonymously. And I understand that there's a lot of fear that if they post a video of mine, people are going to see it and be like, oh, why are you posting porn? But it's just kind of frustrating too, because we can't really get Googled. We advertise our own stuff and we get banned. So I really appreciate it when followers of mine, even anonymously, will repost my stuff. So
yeah, and I have, the benefit that I'm a writer primarily and an educator. So I think if you're doing video, if you're doing video or you're creating art and talking about sexuality or exploring sexuality or just making stuff to turn people on, because there's nothing wrong with that. People seem to think visual is more pornographic than textual.
Yeah.
And even within the visual, I remember this was years ago in psychology courses I took, people will judge the exact same scenes. They did tests, like people having sex scenes. If they're in black and white or sepia tone, they're artsy and sensual. But if they're in color, then it's porn. And they're exact same scenes, right?
Funny you say that. So Stripe is, one of the online payment things. And I tried to use them a while ago to sell digital artistic nude photography that, it's in color, but I'm not doing anything sexual. I'm like dressed in a, semi see-through toga, posing in nature. And Stripe banned it, saying I was selling porn, but they said if I were to like run it through a Photoshop filter to make it look painted, suddenly it's art. And it's like,
yes,
photography is art too. Like what?
Yeah.
It's absurd. So what is your audience feedback like? You're talking about being an educator and a writer. Do you get a lot of fan mail and hate mail, and how does it make you feel? And if you do, how do you respond to it?
It can be really difficult for a reader to find someone who writes a book. You can reach out to them like in their social media, or you can reach out to them to their publisher, but usually no one's going to reach out to you like your home address or your phone number. That said, I've had 2 stalkers so far in my life who did go to the effort to find out, my home phone number and where I lived. And I've had to deal with those, not recently.
That's terrifying.
In terms of like teaching, one of the things I really like about teaching more face-to-face than online, though, the pandemic kind of changed a lot of that, is you get that immediate feedback, right? So if I'm working with a group of people and we're doing my workshops or I'm giving a lecture, I can just look and I can see, how is the audience responding? Are people taking notes? Are people leaning toward me? Are people leaving?
By and large, body language to judge. Right?
And you lose a lot of that online, I feel like, even if you have video. But most people who come to my stuff, I've never heard like a complaint like, well, I didn't think that it was going to be like this. So I must write really honest descriptions of what I'm going to do. My fiction, I mean, it really depends. Early on, my first couple of books got some really harsh reviews online. I had one guy who said, well, this whole idea that women being in charge, that's not possible. So this is just ridiculous. And I was like, so basically you have a concept of what relationships should be like. This didn't match it. And so you gave the book 1 star.
Jeez.
And that's kind of the problem with like online ratings, right? It's all very subjective.
Yeah. And people love to comment negatively more than positively. So.
Yes. And it can be a real struggle to get people to just write reviews.
Yeah. Well, again, like they're so nervous that like somehow it'll get back to them and, they'll be judged for it, even if they use anonymous.
Yeah. So the people who write reviews, most of them seem to really like what I do, but it can be a real struggle. Now, when I go to events, whether it's a mainstream, fandom, geekdom convention like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, or I'm going to a kinky event and people will come up to me. That's when they're really very expressive, is that face-to-face interaction. I think because first they have to get up the courage to actually approach me, and then they'll say stuff that sometimes blows me away. I've had a couple people say to me, this book or this article changed my life.
Aw.
Or you made me feel like this is something I could do.
Yeah.
Or when is the next book coming out? That's also a really, really good one, right? Yeah, it's interesting. They're freer face-to-face because my Patreon page, people usually don't comment. They don't even
people are weird on Patreon. Like, I barely get any interaction with and I'm like, you're paying, $2 a month to support me. You think they would respond more? It's weird.
I can look at the analytics and see X number of people read it, but they won't even usually hit the like button. But man, so one of the things I put on my Patreon is I'm writing a serialized novel for them. And I'll confess, I'm actually very bored with this novel. And I would like to stop. But every time I bring that up, that is when they respond. And the response is, please don't stop.
Aww.
I'm like, well, me, and I don't know how to say any more clearly. If you left comments each time or even just hit the heart button, then that would give me energy back to continue a story that I've actually become bored with.
It's really similar with me and my videos where it's like, again, I understand the stigma of replying and leaving comments on stuff like mine. But when the only feedback I get is from haters, it really makes it hard to keep putting effort into my stuff. So, same thing with you. If you like somebody's work, if you support them, please go the extra mile to let them know. Like and comment and stuff. Yes, it helps with social media engagement, but even beyond that, it's what keeps us going. So
I totally agree. I think just hitting like, I mean,
it takes 2 seconds.
And I know on places like Facebook and stuff, you can hover over that to see how many people have liked something. But then it's like an extra step, right, to actually click on that and look at it. And I'm not even sure you can do that on Patreon. I can do it because I'm the creator, but I've never been able to, the people I follow, I've never been able to go and see who's liked this. I can just see, 2 people have liked it or 20 people have liked it. You're very anonymous at that point.
It makes me think of YouTube getting rid of the downvote. You can't see downvotes anymore, which is interesting because I remember when the trailer for, I think it was the female version of the Ghostbusters came out, the movie wasn't even out yet. And it was the most disliked video on YouTube. And it's just people are stupid. I wanted to say when you were talking about writing descriptions for your education classes, how you haven't really had negative feedback. I did an interview quite a while ago now with a fellow who started the Just Naked podcast. And they also would have events, though again, with COVID, it kind of tapered off. I don't know if they're having them again, but they'd have events that were naked yoga or something like that. They're more nudist focused. So full body nudity, but non-sexual. And they have people show up that are just expecting a swinger party. And they're very clear when they describe the event. So it's so interesting that you're doing these classes that are about kink and sex, and you're getting people that are not treating it, like a swinger party. But then you have people just talking about nudity, and it is. And to me, that indicates people who are going to go to a class about kink already know enough to know the difference between nudity, actually having sex, talking about sex, etc. When you're talking about people coming up to you at conventions, oh my God, I can't talk today.
Welcome to my world every day.
So when you're talking about people coming up to you at conventions, are you talking about conventions where people go to meet porn stars, or are these more academic?
So I go to basically 2 types of conventions now. So I left traditional academia because there came a point where there were literally no jobs in my field for 2 years. And I said, forget that. I'll just focus on writing. And even now, good luck finding a tenure track job in ancient history. That's, they'd rather pay a person a tiny amount of money to pay 6 classes a semester and give them no benefits. And as long as people are willing to do that, they're going to keep doing it now. So I'm just like, I'm kind of glad I left, because there's no way I was going to move my family someplace where I might not have
and
job
now,
security.
Obviously, there's even more hatred of educators who even mention that gay people exist. So I imagine trying to find a place that will even let you teach a class on sexuality or something is quite limited. So
yeah, well, I would have taught ancient history, but it might have included gender and sexuality. But yeah, it's just in the past 2 decades, there's been a real denigration of intelligence and expertise and education. And I think it's to our great detriment. But I go to like 2 types of conventions.
Not to get into politics. I'm like, I have things to say, but I'm not going to say them. Not on topic.
So I go to 2 different types of events right now. There's the kink community stuff. So people who are going to that, they know what they're coming for. They in some way either deeply identify as kinky, or they're at that stage where they're exploring and they want to get all the information they can. These also tend to be, except for the munches, which, are free. You show up and you pay for your dinner and you talk.
And they're not, you don't actually like munch each other. They're called munches because you tend to eat.
Yeah.
Because I know the first time my friend, so I have a friend who is getting into stuff like that, and he mentioned going to these munches, and I was like, is that like where you go and have sex? He's like, no, it's where you go meet other people and you talk about kink. And I was like, oh, okay. Because that name, carpet muncher.
So the other types, which would be like going to a play party or to an educational,
which is a place where you
or an educational event, those are going to cost money. So there's like that automatic filter anyway. So you have like the 2 filters, right? People already know they're interested or they identify as kinky, and then they have to make that financial jump.
Yeah.
So
and I assume there's also a vetting process too, to make sure that someone doesn't have like a criminal history of, molestation or something.
Well,
like
and then you have to sign forms, legal forms, and like you can't take photographs except in very limited areas, and things like that. And there are rules about how the number one rule, which may surprise people who don't truly understand BDSM, is almost always within the top 3 rules for any kink event I've been to, is do not touch people without their consent.
There's a thing with cosplayers that's getting more conversation now, but I've seen a lot of discussions where it's like, just because someone's in a sexy cosplay does not give you permission to go up and touch them. And you're not really supposed to take pictures of cosplayers without them saying, go ahead. Also, because it's wild how many people think, oh, they're, in a sexual situation or they're dressed sexily or whatever, therefore I can go up and touch them. Like, I get these insane comments from men who are like, well, if women are allowed to go topless in public, I should be allowed to touch their breasts. What? Ugh, men. Not all men.
Yeah. And so the other type of event I do are more general fandom. So like people who like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, things like that. I'm now starting to try to find more general events. So I went to my first holiday event. I was part of a group of authors and we went, and I thought at the very least I'll learn what sort of books will sell at this type of event. Because we're talking about an event where there were thousands of people. Thousands, for 6 days. So there were probably close to 20,000 people who went through this event.
Are these people writers, or are they people looking for stuff to read?
Yeah, they're just people looking for stuff to give for gifts for Christmas.
Oh, okay.
So the books were like one little area. So there was like an entire page, and on the map of it, it was like, here are the authors, so it was called out quite a bit. Okay. And I was, this was a big deal for me to decide to go to this event. I didn't even know they had events
like that.
Because I'm like, am I going to be next to a whole bunch of children's books authors? No, it turns out I wasn't. I was next to people who write like thrillers and mysteries and romance. That was going to be my question. But really adult material. And so it was an interesting experience. I'll go back next year, but just for one day instead of 2. because of the flow of traffic and interest and expense.
Yeah.
So that's a new thing I'm getting into. But at sci-fi, fantasy, horror, fandom conventions, there is a huge overlap with people who are kinky or who are interested in kink. Yeah. To the point where I have taught introductory classes, like basically SM 101 or what is kink at these events, and I'll get a dozen to 2 dozen people coming because they want to know.
Yeah.
And so,
well, especially, like, they read 50 Shades and they're like, I want to know more. And then hopefully you put them on the right path.
Yeah. And then, of course, I do like individual groups might invite me to a munch or invite me to an event. So
is it local people usually that go to these things?
I'll travel to other states and things like that to do this. Right before the pandemic, so I have a consensual slave, folks. Emphasis on the word consensual, please. And he and I went to Illinois. And when I say right before the pandemic, I mean like we went in early February.
That's when I got it the first time.
Things were closed down where we were.
Yeah, I got COVID in February, so.
And, I went to their clubhouse. We were there for 6 hours. They gave us food. They actually paid for a hotel for us. Wow. They also gave me a stipend, which I wasn't expecting. I don't ask for stipends. I ask for my expenses to be covered and the ability to try to sell my books. That's what I want to do. And, they had me talk about, I can't remember what the subject was at this point. I think it might have been the decision to be out. Like, what sort of things do you need to think about before you do that? Yeah.
And like then you said, that's a really big step. So people probably have a lot of questions about it.
And then, we did mention, while I would have taught ancient history, and I have taught ancient history, I've been called back a few times to my old university to teach classes. And I do an educational program at a museum here where I live as well. I did work with psychology department, sociology department, and the human sexuality department. And I organized groups of panelists who came in to talk about BDSM for them, for their classes. And I did that for 4 years. So I guess it's sort of sounding like if you're getting it, education has really been my driving force behind all this. Fiction is something I've always done. And I write what I call edgy fiction. I don't say I write erotica. I say I write edgy fiction. And that's because
interesting.
I'll use as much sex and violence as are necessary to tell the story and not one sentence more.
Yeah, I was actually going to say when you're talking about, sharing space with thriller writers and stuff like that, I talk a lot about how horror, movies, but books also and stuff like that, is such a broad category. And what's nice about horror is that because they've already established that adult themes are going to go into it, there's so much more freedom to talk about sexual stuff too, and nudity and stuff like that. I get a little frustrated that horror is considered so broad. And I also rant a lot about how, especially in American culture, we're fine with violence, but we're totally anti-female nipple, anti-nudity, anti-sex and stuff like that. Having a thriller or whatever, you're more likely to encounter something like that. So when you go to events like that, you don't have to be like in a little room that you have to be 18 and older to enter. You just say edgy.
Yeah, not so far I have it. There are events where they do that, where they will put different audience expectations. They'll divide up the creators, but haven't had that yet. Yeah. I will tell the organizers, this is what I'm making. So I'm more likely to be next to the people writing clearly more adult themed stuff. So like the thrillers, the mysteries, the romance stuff. Yeah. That's where I'm more likely to be. And that's fine because I don't really want to be next to the person selling, Charlie the Chipmunk has a holiday. That's not
unless they're furries.
That's not necessarily appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, when they do take, like, even just, like you said, written books or whatever, and they put it in its own section, that's really going to affect your outreach, because a lot of people are going to be like, I don't want to be seen over there, you know? Speaking of romance, when, in your opinion, does something go from being just a romance to being like edgy or erotic or whatever? Like, at what point is it too graphic? Like when you actually say penis instead of manhood, or?
I think so. Romance as a genre within literature is a whole set of guidelines and rules and expectations. Early on in my career, I looked into, could I write a romance? Because romance, folks, is the #1 selling genre of books.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually make a living as a romance writer. And for almost any other type of book out there, the Stephen Kings and the Jackie Collins and Dean Koontz and people like that, they're like the 1% of the 1% who are making money. But if you're a romance writer, you can make a passable living simply because people consume these books like candy.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons they do that is they know exactly what's going to happen in that book. Mm-hmm. So when I was looking into this, I was sent back guidelines from publishers saying, okay, so your book is going to have X number of chapters. The female character must be this way.
Yeah.
The male character lead must be this way. In this chapter, they meet. They must hate or dislike each other. By this chapter, she's in jeopardy. By this chapter, he's come to save her. And it's like, and to this point, because we've gotten more, it's become more acceptable to have more sexual content in these books. They now also lift out, in this chapter, you should have a sex scene. And then by this chapter, they should go a little further in the next sex scene. And that, you know, I was like, I can't do that.
That explains why, like, so many scenes happen at the same point in a book. Sheesh.
Yes. Now you know the terrible secret. It is literally a template. And you're supposed to write to it. And I don't like people telling me what to do. So I was like, you know, I don't really think I can do this. Yeah. Oddly, readers don't necessarily have the same definition of what's romantic and what's romance. So I've had people tell me that some of my books are romantic. And I think what they mean is that I'm always writing about relationships. And sometimes, well, many cases, at least 2 or more people figure out a way to make their relationship work. So there's at least a somewhat happy ending to the story. And so they perceive that as, oh, it's romantic. But a romance publisher would be like, no, that's no. They would agree with that old reviewer of mine who gave me 1 star once, saying, oh, it can't be in the lead. That's not possible. So
yeah. Yeah, I don't really read books as much as I used to. I say social media broke my brain. Plus, my husband goes to bed so early that I don't like having the light on reading next to him. But yeah, I used to tear through romances, and I would find myself going more and more to like dark fantasy and historical fiction and stuff, because so many romances, there's the same old tropes. And I mean, it's fine if people like reading about basically the same exact characters doing the same exact things. I prefer to be a little bit surprised. And have something else going on besides them getting closer to having sex. So again, it's almost like with romance, similar to horror, I wish that there were more subcategories widely discussed, because I like having romance in a story, but I don't want that to be the main focus of everything.
Yeah. So where that line is anymore between erotica and romance, I think it's becoming blurrier. More and more things that are just considered romance are having more explicit sex scenes. So I think it depends on what type of sex you're having. I guarantee you, if there's kink involved, you're probably going to be considered more that dark romance. Or if there's anything that's questionable consent, or there's non-consensuality, that's probably going to push you over into the erotic category. But also, I personally like the definition that one of my first publishers, her name is Cecilia Tan, and she created Circlette Books. Circlette Books is still around, folks. It's just now part of a bigger publishing house, which is still a not terribly large publishing house, but you can still find Circlet Press books out there. She said to me once, the line between erotic and pornography is the purpose of the story. Erotica is about characters.
Yeah.
And the sex they have pushes their development as characters, or it pushes the plot. Porn is about body parts having sex. That's the point.
I was literally about to say, so like I used to do AMAs as kind of a Patreon perk, and I would get these ones about like, describe your favorite sexual fantasy. And I would kind of almost do a cheap shot answer where I wouldn't like describe, oh, he's wearing this and he does this. I'd say, you know, the only sex scenes that I get anything out of are if I'm invested in the character. And so many people kind of make fun of like Bridgerton because they actually, it's simulated, but they actually show the characters having sex. And so all these people are like, oh, it's just porn. And it's like your standards for what is porn have been so skewed because anything more than a mwah is like porn. And yet, you know, I don't know, 20 years ago and a little bit more, even having a kiss was considered, you know, racy. And that's why you have like all these old movies where they're just like cheek to cheek. They don't actually kiss. So as you said, it's getting more blurred. And I hope that we can have more stories like Bridgerton and some parts of Game of Thrones. There's other parts that where you get attached to the characters, because I get nothing from, you know, the pizza delivery guy and the MILF just suddenly having sex. And again, it's fine if you do. I'm not saying that stuff shouldn't exist. I'm saying me as a consumer, I will never go towards that. So, you know, it's an expanded market.
So I describe what I do as edgy fiction because I also talk about subjects that are difficult. Many of my main heroes or heroines are survivors of sexual abuse or rape because that's my life. You know, I was taught write what you know. And we have this idea in our culture that if you've been abused sexually, one of two things happens. Either you become like an out of control slut, right? Because you don't know how to interact with anyone any other way but sexually, or you become completely and utterly incapable of having sex.
Yeah.
And that is not the reality for the vast majority of us. And so I write about that topic. I write about non-consensuality. My fans wish I would write non-consensual stuff even more. But I limit that to my fantasy and sci-fi and historical fiction because it should be clear to people that's fiction. No one's zooming around in a space rocket and picking up people here today. But if I write a contemporary story, then sorry, and you know, people are going to talk about issues before they have sex. There's going to be a negotiation scene. It's going to be clearly laid out that this is consensual, mutually beneficial relationship.
So you're saying in your contemporary things, you won't write a rape scene?
No, I won't. I won't write a rape scene. Now, the character might be a survivor. That's mentioned, but I'm not going to like show you anything about that.
Right. You're not feeding into that fetish. When you do have a character that does something bad like that, do they always get punished, or is it more realistic where a lot of times they get away with it?
So my bad guys don't get away with things. My bad guys end up getting horrible things done to them or killed, or simply left because, you know, the heroine or hero decides, I don't need you. I'm moving on. And when I talk about the abuse, I am focused on the emotionalness of the abuse. I'm not giving a blow by blow of what has physically happened. So I have a trilogy called Beyond the Softness of His Fur. Some people also consider it furry fiction, but this is like a future set at the beginning of the next century. So there's issues about climate change, water. Countries have dissolved. because it's so hard to control things that things would just kind of fallen back on the city-state model, because you can kind of control that.
Shadowrun. People are going to immediately recognize the game system Shadowrun because that's kind of a similar thing. So that's cool.
Yeah. And of course I base that on ancient communities where, you know, you didn't have sprawling empires. You had like one or two cities, and that's what you could control. Yeah. And in that story, in the first book, the main male character, who is a genetically modified animal, so he's got a lot of human traits and he has greater intelligence, and he's been purposely created to be a slave class, basically. He is left
Rocket Raccoon.
Yeah. He is left at home of his new owner and her lazy, horrific brother rapes him. We don't see the brother approach. What we see is that main character going like, oh, you know, who's this? Hi, what do you want? And being really friendly and open because that's how he's been trained to be. And then going like, wait, what? This hurts. What are you doing? I don't like this. So you don't see it, but everyone who reads it knows exactly what is happening, because it is all about the main characters feeling, you know, confused and then horrified.
Yeah.
And because that's really what's happening. It's, you know, when you are raped, it isn't the acts themselves. It is that your value as a person has been shattered because the other person has said, you are not a person, you are an object. And so, you know, I'm sorry if this is depressing people, but
no, well, like every time you say something, I'm like, oh, that makes me think of something else. Cause like what you're talking about right now just made me think of the Kavanaugh hearings when they had, you know, rape accusers talking about how they felt. And you had all these people be like, well, what day, at what moment did this happen? Did this happen? And it's not, you don't remember exacts. You remember, like you said, the trauma and everything like that. And so that, you know, writing something like that does a great job of helping others understand what it feels like, at least in those characters' cases. So,
and that is, you know, partially my goal is I want people to understand these things happen. This is the edgy thing I'm talking about, is I'm not going to pretend this doesn't happen. It happens.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but it's probably going to happen in the future too. It certainly happened in the past. But then I also sometimes will talk about a lot of socio-political stuff in my writing. And that can be really unexpected and edgy, because then I'm asking hard questions. I have a new book out. It just came out 2 weeks ago, called Almost Partners. And it's the first book of a new series. And the entire series is about how do societies create and maintain gender injustices. That is the entire series. At its core, that is what it is about. And each book is going to look at a different aspect of society and say, these are the things that have to happen in that society in order to keep people shoved in gender boxes and to keep society then using some people for the benefit of other people.
Yeah.
And I hope it sells really well. The first 4 books are contracted for, but it's also
how do they buy it?
So you can buy, if you visit my website, you go to TammyJoEckhart.com. I have a publication section, and then you can
links
go to
will obviously be in the description of the video. So
yes, you go to these places, you can find links to all my books. It's the brand new book. I think it has a beautiful cover on it. It's very elegant looking, full figured, by the way, realistic looking woman. Because she's in this matriarchal future where women can be fat and happy and everything's fine, right?
Nice.
Or they look like me, is what I should say. And yeah, I hope
they look like
well.
normal people.
Yeah, like normal people. And you know, we talked about how I got into writing. I started writing this series in 5th grade.
Oh wow! So you went. Well, so I was gonna say, when you're writing something like that, what is your process for, first of all, like if it's set in a particular period or maybe it's dealing with a scientific thing, how do you research stuff like that? And also, do you show your work to other people as you're writing it, or like describe situations to get feedback on things that you haven't experienced so that you can, you know, like maybe the male experience of being raped and stuff like that? Like, what is your process for putting that into your work?
So I was raised to believe that if you're a writer, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, but especially if it's fiction, you first write what you know, and secondly, you research what you don't. So as a historian, and yes, my degree is in ancient history, but I have taught classes and assisted in teaching classes all the way from ancient history into the modern era.
So you already have a lot of research in your head.
Yeah.
So.
And I also, I have helped with 5 World War II classes. I really do not want to know anything else about World War II. I'm over it. It's just, I would have gone in and studied that field.
Well, you're about to go through World War III, so buckle up.
Yeah. But one of the things I see is we have this saying, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. It isn't just a saying. Human beings were human beings. We have very similar needs. Physical needs, psychological needs, communal needs. And so shouldn't be surprising that you see in history similar things over and over and over again. It's not just we haven't learned. It's that sometimes we actually need these places. We all want to feel connected to other people. We all need resources, and then it becomes a matter of what's our technology or how do we value other people. And so I use a lot of historical knowledge in my fiction writing. I've had some people come up to me after they've read a book or a short story of mine and say, are you a sociologist or a historian? Because my world crafting, what they say is, it seems so possible. And if it's historical, I'll do research and I want it to be historical. My second book was a collection of stories based on Amazon legends from antiquity.
Oh, cool.
And so each story started with a quotation from an ancient source. But I spent time, I have a story in there about Alexander the Great and the Amazon Queen, because this was a story. He met with the Amazon Queen. They had sex for 13 days and nights, apparently without stopping. And then when she realized she was pregnant, she's like, okay, bye-bye. And, went off. And so I wanted to know, okay, here, I know the time period this would have to happen in. What type of technology do they have? What would their horses be like? What were their, what were their clothes made out of and things like that? Or an older story, like, this is Bronze Age. So what do they have? What materials do they have? And my minor doctoral degrees are in folklore and the history of gender and sexuality. So I have a lot of that sort of academic training. So I can judge sources, like, why are you saying this? Where is the evidence? So I do a lot of that. For the science stuff, I'm a very lucky woman in that I currently have 2 partners. They are men, but I'm not heterosexual. So that's just where we are right now with 2 men. And they are both scientists. They're both scientists and they work with computers. Nice. So usually if I see something like I was writing, I mentioned Beyond the Softness of His Fur. But one of my partners also identifies as a furry, but I was like, so would this be possible? And there were some articles about creating chimeras or like inserting human DNA or animal DNA and how would this work? And I was like, so, I talk it over with them and show them and they can like help me figure out what's too outrageous and what isn't. And then I have a set group of beta readers who will read my stuff. And I have a beta editor and they read everything first. So just so folks know, I am a writer, published writer, but I also have dyslexia. Yes, you can have dyslexia, be a writer, and get a doctorate. It is possible. It's work, but it is possible. They read through everything to make sure that it's clean. So like, I apologize if I say some words oddly. Sometimes I don't hear things the same. I don't hear things the same way other people do. So I might say words differently or spell words differently. And he'll clean it up. And then my group of beta readers, they read it for the story. And they have no problem coming back and saying, I like this and this and this, but this doesn't make any sense. And, so that's my process. Other writers use like writers workshop groups and stuff. But my experience with that is that most of the time is very difficult to get other writers to read and comment on your work because they are so busy themselves writing.
Yeah.
That it kind of becomes, I'm sorry,
just reading
crude.
Your own stuff.
It kind of becomes like a circle jerk.
Yeah.
Of just sharing your stuff.
I was going to say a lot of like creator groups are like that too. YouTube groups, you're supposed to like watch and comment on each other's. People just post their own links and then leave.
Yeah.
So yeah, that makes sense. When they do give you feedback, if it's like, say they don't like a scene that you really care about, do you still kind of make a case by case basis and be like, well, I'm going to rewrite this, but I really want this scene in there? Or do you put your own ego on check and be like, well, I like the scene, but 3 out of 4 people don't. Therefore, I should probably get rid of it.
Usually they're not commenting on the content of the scene. So no one would say like, I don't like the sex act or I don't like this character. They might say, I don't understand the motivation here. Or this seems to contradict something earlier. Or, whoa, this just happened out of nowhere. And so that's kind of the level of feedback I'm getting.
There's a lot of movies and shows I wish had more planning like that.
Especially horror movies.
And fantasy and just, there's one I saw recently that like the first half was pretty good. And then it just went just plot holes everywhere. And I'm like, did a different writer take over all of a sudden or something? Or you got Game of Thrones season 8. But anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this video into 2. We're going to keep recording, but I'm going to cut this video into 2. So if anyone watching this wants to hear part 2, where I'm actually going to start asking you about your personal experiences with kink and, like you said, having a consensual slave and stuff like that, go to toplesstopics.org/contact, follow all my social media, and I will post when that new video is out. So cool.